Hello everybody and welcome to another instalment of Year 6 Story Time. I'm glad you enjoyed Chapter 10, it was quite a long chapter and I know Tofu certainly appreciated all of the positive feedback from everybody. He was so happy that he decided he would dress up a little bit for today and he's worn his special bow tie. As you can see, there he is, looking very smart indeed. Okay Tofu, you ready for a bit more story time? Chapter 11 today. Let's get you nice and comfortable. Oh! Good boy. Okay, chapter 11 is called Friday. Mrs. Fletcher was bending over the last of a bed of weeds, hoping finally to rid herself of them before her husband returned from the potato harvesting. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of heavy footsteps and loud barking. She looked up vacantly. It was Tom Oakley. Easing herself gently to her feet, she leaned slowly backwards. Her spine gave a soft cracking sound. "Back early, ain't you?" she remarked. "Yous ain't finished, has you? I ain't started tea for Ben yet." "He's staying on," said Tom. "I decided I'd come home early tonight. Boy's got friends coming round. You're George for one." "So he said." Tom grunted. "I just thought I'd be around, like, in case he needs anything. Tends to get overexcited." A strand of auburn hair fell across Mrs. Fletcher's eyes. She brushed it aside. "Don't seem so long since his birthday, do it?" 2 months, commented Tom absently, and he gazed down the road, remembering how he watched Willy's thin little hunched body stumbling after Sammy on that first day. "You heard from his mother yet?" "I had a letter last week, mostly about him being bad and me watching him like. I wish he would be bad. He says yes or dunno to every blessed thing I says." Mrs. Fletcher laughed. "I wish George would." She picked up a bucket filled with weeds. "What about this 6 shillings contribution then?" "That's what she wrote about. She says she can't pay yet, but it'll be on its way. Says it means she won't be coming to see the boy for Christmas." "Shame on her," tutted Mrs. Fletcher. "Oh, I dunno," said Tom. "He's changed quite a bit in these last few weeks." "So has you and all," thought Mrs. Fletcher. "Yes," he went on, "I almost fancy he's grown a bit. It won't do him no harm to be out of his mother's apron strings for a bit longer. She puts the fear of the devil into him anyways." He leaned across the gate in a confidential manner. "Do you know, Mrs. Fletcher, last week he laughed. It were a bit of a nervous one like, but he actually laughed. It were the first time I ever heard him do it. Didn't think he had a sense of humour in him." Mrs. Fletcher looked steadily into his eyes. His forehead had lost its old furrowed look. The deep pitted wrinkles above his eyes had softened outwards. Behind his scowling manner was a kindly old man, and if it hadn't been for the arrival of a rather insipid little boy, she might never have known, nor might anyone else for that matter. A breeze shook a half-naked tree, causing a handful of leaves to cascade into the garden. "Well," said Mrs. Fletcher, "now that you're here, you might as well take the jersey and socks. I finished them last night." After Tom had collected the woolens, he walked home feeling remarkably relaxed. Sammy scampered leisurely in front of him, while he stopped intermittently to pick up sweet chestnuts on the way. Willy had scraped the potatoes, chopped up carrots and turnips, buttered a few slices of oddly cut bread, and filled Sammy's bowls with fresh water and scraps. His boots were laid out on a newspaper and had been scraped and polished. He was sitting cross-legged on the floor, giving a finishing touch to them, when Tom walked in. He looked up and rubbed his forehead excitedly, leaving another smudge of brown shoe polish above his nose. "I finished my reading book today, and I starts the last one on Monday. And Mrs. Black says I can do joined-up writing," he added, scrambling to his feet. "By half-term I might have finished the last one. Then I can read good enough for Mrs. Hartridge." "Good. You've worked hard for it, and you're bright." "Bright?" "Got it up here," said Tom, tapping his head with his hand. It was after they had cleared supper and were sitting by the range with a cup of tea that the first person to arrive knocked at the front door. Willy, whose stomach had been steadily growing tighter, almost spilt his tea over his shorts. He was wearing the new jersey that Tom had collected from Mrs. Fletcher. It was navy blue with a rolled-topped neck. The cuffs were well turned back, and the jersey came halfway down his shorts. "Aren't you going to answer it then?" said Tom. Willy placed the mug carefully onto the table and made his way nervously out of the door and down the small dark passageway. It was Zack. Willy was glad that he had come first. He showed him into the living room, where Sammy greeted him, wagging his tail. "Unusual jersey, that," commented Tom. It was the first time he had seen Zack's Joseph jersey. "Unique, I'd say," replied Zack. "I'll go put the blacks up and light the lamp," said Tom. Willy and Zack waited at the foot of the ladder, while Sammy scrabbled around the first rung. A square of amber light shone down on them from the open hatch. "I say, it's magnificent," gasped Zack. "Like rays from heaven." Tom climbed down the ladder. "All yours," he said. Sammy by now had wormed his way up to the third rung, where he was floundering and panting breathlessly. "You want Sam with you?" "Won't you be lonely without him, Mr. Oakley?" asked Zack. Tom was a little taken aback at this candid question. "No, I can do some jobs that he gets in the way of. But if he becomes a nuisance, William," he added, "you bang on the floor and I'll pick him up." "Ta," said Willy gratefully, and between him and Zack they carried Sammy up the ladder. Willy had grown used to the changes in his room, so that he was pleasantly surprised at Zack's excitement over it. 2 of the walls were covered with his drawings and paintings, and on one wall were shelves that Tom had fixed up for his clothes and treasures. Zack gazed round at the tiny wooden bed under the eaves, the flickering lamp above their heads, and the cosy patches of colour round the walls gave the room a cosy, lived-in air. After a brief glance at the 2 boxes of apples, which were stacked in the corner, he sat on the end of the bed with Willy and talked about the poem he was writing. It was in the epic vein, which for him meant a long rhyming poem about knights in armour. Sammy, who had been sitting quietly by their feet, jumped up and began barking. There was a loud knock on the open trapdoor, and Carrie and Ginny's heads came into view. "Ain't it beautiful?" commented Ginny. "Like a workroom of one's own," sighed Carrie enviously. They were interrupted by an impatient voice from below. "Stop spooning. I want to see. Hurry up." They clambered up onto the floor, followed eagerly by George, who practically fell over them in his clumsy desire to get in. All 3 of them stared silently at the walls. "You never done these, did you?" said George. There was a drawing of the oak tree, 2 brave attempts at Sammy, a painting of 5 children blackberrying, one of a library with people sitting and walking round, and several sketches of boots and flowers and half-eaten sandwiches. "Sheer genius, aren't they?" said Zack, thrusting his nose upwards. "Wizard choice of friends I have, don't you think?" "Why has you got all them words written under them?" asked George. Willy flushed. "Is it for learning to read?" said Carrie. He nodded. "I starts the last reading book on Monday, and joined up writing." "I say, well done!" exclaimed Zack. "Don't know why you're bothering," grunted George. "You gets to miss around more in your class. Anyways, if I could draw like you, I wouldn't bother about nothing else." "Anything else," corrected Carrie. "And you don't bother about anything anyways." "I does. They just don't teach interesting things at school. Who wants to read books? Books ain't no good. They don't feed animals and plough fields, does they?" Carrie groaned. "Oh, you just pig ignorance." "Hi, Tofu." "Good," said George. "I likes pigs, and pigs is useful." "Are you 2 going to spend this evening ranting again?" interrupted Zack. "Yes, come on," said Ginny. "Let's talk about the Gazette." It was obvious to everyone from the moment they sat down that Zack was bursting to tell them something. "Come on, reveal all," said Carrie, imitating his theatrical way of speaking. "Guess what?" he half squeaked. "Miss Thorne is producing a children's Christmas show for the war effort, and she needs all the help she can get." Ginny gasped. "I couldn't go on stage, I'd hate it." "You needn't act in it. You could help backstage." "You could do your sewing," suggested George. Ginny's face lit up. "I can make costumes." "Well spoken, that man," said Zack. "That's a wizard idea." George cleared his throat and beamed. "I does have the odd unbeatable one," he said smartily. "I'm glad to hear that," said Zack. because I'm going to ask you for another good suggestion." George visibly preened himself. "Go ahead," he said. "What are you going to do in the show?" His face fell. "Me?" he spluttered. "Me? I ain't doing no fancy theatricals with old Corny Thorny. She's nutty as a fruitcake." "Coward," said Kerry. "I ain't going to do it," he protested, "and that's a fact." "I vote we bring this meeting to order," said Ginny sharply. Zack looked at George. "Well," he said, "are you going to be courageous or not?" "Coward," repeated Carrie. "Oh, all right," said George crossly. "I'll do it." "Whizzo, that's two." "What about you, Zack?" asked Carrie. "Oh, I expect I'll volunteer for one of the leads," he said, leaning back and crossing his long brown legs nonchalantly. He turned to Willy. "I ain't been near a theatre. Me mum says—" "It isn't exactly a theatre," interrupted Zack earnestly. "It's the hall. It's just that we're going to make it into a theatre." "Yeah, but—" "You needn't perform. You could help with the scenery." "Painting, like," said Kerry. He smiled nervously. "Yeah, all right." "I'll volunteer too," said Kerry. "I don't mind what I do, so long as I don't have too many lines to learn." "Whizzo!" yelled Zack. "That's the five of us." He studied Sammy, who was chewing the toe of one of his large stuffed boots. "No," said George and the twins in unison. He looked at Willy. "You'll have to ask Mr. Tom," he said. 3 against 2, said Kerry. "Oh, all right," he sighed wearily. "I give in." "My turn now for news," said George. "Who's going to have a big carol service in the church on Christmas Eve?" "So we's going to have a big carol service in the church on Christmas Eve. Mr. Bush started rehearsing us last night, and he could do with some extra voices like." Carrie opened her mouth. "Boys only," he added. "Ain't it a blimmin' cheek?" she exclaimed angrily. "Boys get all the chances. The grammar school in Weirwood only takes boys," she said in protest to Zack, "and they never bother to put girls in for the high school. And here's me, dying to go, and him," she said, waving a finger at George, "having all the chances, and him hating books." "Maybe now there's a war on," said Ginny, gently touching her sister's arm, "it'll all be different for girls." She knew how much learning meant to her. "I hope so, but it don't seem no different being at war, really, do it? 'Cept there's more going on in the evenings with first aid and the like." There was a short silence. "Well," said George, glancing at Willy and Zack, "you two interested?" "I'd like to," said Zack, "but I never go to church, so it'll be a bit strange if I sing in it, won't it? Me not even being a Christian." "Ain't you a Christian?" asked Willy in alarm. He shook his head. "No, I thought you knew that." Willy expected at any moment to see the tips of 2 red horns slowly emerging from under his hair. But they didn't. "You could always ask the vicar," suggested George. "But what if I had to say your prayers? I might have to say things I don't believe in. It leaves me in a bit of a dilemma, don't you see?" "Do what?" said George. "Quagmire," said Zack. And he gave a sigh and threw his hands up in the air. "I mean, I'd like to, but I've already been shouldered out of the nativity play. It's rotten, rotten luck. I know the story quite well, too. I mean, your Jesus that you believe was God was Jewish, wasn't he? Joseph, his father, was Jewish, and so was his mother. And here's me dying to act, and I can't be in it because I'm Jewish." "Now you know how I feel about the high school," said Kerry. "Oh, get the handkerchiefs out for a weep," groaned George, pretending to play the violin. "I'll do it," said Willy suddenly. "I'll sing." George beamed. "Rehearsals every Thursday. I'll give you a hand in the reading if you get stuck." "That's 2 bits of news for the Gazette," said Ginny. "We need to do something a bit more exciting like," said George impatiently. "Let's go looking for badgers, or even their holes. How about it? Who's for going?" "I'd like to," blurted out Willy. They all stared at him in surprise. It was unusual for him to volunteer without persuasion. "I'll come too," said Zack. "I don't know anything about badgers, but it might be useful. Who knows? Perhaps one day I may have to play one." Carrie and Ginny looked at each other. "We'll come too," they sighed in a tone of resignation. "I ain't forcing you," said George. "I say," said Zack, "what was that mysterious place you were talking about at Aunt Nancy's?" Ginny paled. "Spooky cop," she whispered. "Couldn't we go and look at that as well?" George and the twins gave no answer, and Willy felt a cold prickle crawl up his back and into his hair. "Oh, come on," cried Zack. "It can't be that frightening, can it?" All three of them nodded silently. "We ain't been there for 2 years now," said George. "I say, what happened?" "Nothing you could exactly put your finger on, like," said Carrie ominously. "But there was a strange, eerie feeling in the air. The trees—" She swallowed. "The trees, they seemed to groan and wave their arms about." "Let's go. I mean, if we all go together, we can protect each other." "When was you thinking?" asked George, in an unusually timid voice. "How about tonight?" whispered Zack. Ginny gave a shiver. "Or," he continued, "Halloween!" and he gave a shrieking imitation of a cackling witch. George and the twins yelled, and Willy clutched Sammy, who had started barking. Zack gave a long, ghostly moan and raised his hands. With wide, blank eyes, he shuffled towards them. They stumbled backwards. Willy tried to calm Sammy, who was jumping about excitedly. "That's enough," said Ginny crossly. "All right, spoil sports," he said, feeling disgruntled, and he sat down, missed his cushion, and landed with a painful thump on the floor. This time it was the others who laughed. He rubbed his bottom vigorously, looking very hurt. They were interrupted by a knocking on the hatch. "Blimmin' heck," said Carrie. "Now we're for it," whispered her sister. "I told you we was making too much noise," and she glared at Zack. "Don't foist all the blame on I," he retorted. Willy lifted it up to find Tom standing on the steps, with a large tray in his hands. On it was a jug of lemonade, 5 cups, a plate of ginger snaps, and a bowl of nuts. Beside it was a small saucer of salt. "Hot chestnuts!" yelled Willy. "They has them in London when it's Christmas. I seed them sell them in the streets lots of times, but I ain't never tasted them like." "Thought maybe you could use them." "Rather," cried Zack. "Mr. Tom, you're a real brick." "Am I?" he mumbled. He looked around at their delighted faces and began to feel embarrassed. "You best eat them before they gets cold." Sammy wriggled into his arms and pushed his head underneath Tom's chin. "Had enough, have you, boy?" he said, picking him up, and with that he gave them all a brisk wave and disappeared down the steps, closing the hatch quickly behind him. "He's a real decent sort, Will," said Zack. "You're awfully lucky being landed on someone like him." Willy smiled. He'd known that since the first bewildering day. "I'm lucky too," he went on, "with the doctor and Aunt Nance." "That's because they're daft like you," said George, through a mouthful of ginger biscuits. "I don't think Christine and Robert King are very happy," said Ginny. "They're staying at one of the tied cottages at Hillbrook Farm, and they has to earn their keep, especially now that John's gone." "Robert fell asleep in history on Monday," said Carrie. "Don't blame him," said George. "And Christine told me," continued Ginny, "that Mr. Barnes threatened to have their dog put down if they didn't work hard enough." "Here, have a chestnut," said Carrie, flinging one into her sister's hands. "Yes, let's eat," added George. After they had devoured the nuts and drunk the lemonade, they discussed who would write what for the Gazette. It was unanimously decided that any drawings or illustrations would be done by Willy. Zack was to finish his epic poem and write a report on the Christmas show. Carrie would put in a bit of news regarding how the war was affecting the supply of sweets. Ginny was to write about the wonders of the first aid group, and George about his beloved badgers. The meeting had ended, with everyone feeling very satisfied. They scrambled down the ladder, yelling their goodbyes. Willy watched them as they ran through the graveyard and climbed over the wall to the lane. He closed the door, walked into the living room, and sank happily into the armchair. Tom glanced at him. The last time Willy had had so many children at the cottage, he had been sick. Tonight he looked healthily tired. "Let's have a look at that old arm of yours," he said. Willy sleepily pulled his jersey and shirt off and slid to the edge of the armchair. Tom squatted down in front of him. Very gently he cleaned a sore and put some ointment on it. It was the last one. "This time next week should be gone," he muttered, but Willy didn't hear him. His eyelids were already fluttering into sleep. Tom helped him into his pyjamas, carried him up the ladder on his back, and put him to bed. When Willy woke the next day, there was something altogether unusual about the morning. He lay in bed for some time and stared up at the ceiling, trying to puzzle it out. Finally he gave up and clambered out of bed. It was only when he started automatically to strip it that he realised what it was that was so different. I wonder what it is. There was no need for the sheets to be washed that day. They were dry. So it sounds like Willy has stopped wetting the bed, which I'm sure he'll be very happy about. Chapter 12 is called The Show Must Go On, so I wonder if there'll be some kind of show or performance in Chapter 12. So we look forward to that next time. And for now, from Sleepy Tofu and me, it's goodbye, and we'll see you next time for a bit more Year 6 story time. Bye-bye!